Welcome to the Lake Bluff Joint Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals regular meeting on October 18th, 2023. Roll call, please.
Yes. Member Danley?
Here.
Member Fisher? Here. Member Miller?
Here.
Member Russell?
Here.
Member Sorensen is not going to be in attendance. Chair Peters?
Here.
Great.
The quorum of the PCZBA is physically present at the meeting. In regards to Member Tall, a notice was received in accordance with village policy, and Member Tall will be deemed authorized to attend the meeting electronically unless a motion objecting to the member's electronic attendance is made, seconded, and approved by 2/3 of the members of the PCZBA physically present at the meeting. Hearing no motion, Member Tall can participate. And before we get to agenda item number 2, we just want to thank everyone for coming out and joining our community conversation on missing middle housing within the context of our comprehensive land use plan update. We will have the presentation first. That'll be agenda item number 4, saving questions and comments for the end. But before we get to that, we've got 2 quick items to attend. Non-agenda items and visitors' public comment time. As the public is aware, we allocate 15 minutes at each of our meetings for any member of the community to present on any non-agenda item. Anyone from the community that wishes to present tonight? Hearing none and seeing none, we'll proceed to agenda item number 3, consideration of the September 2023 regular and special meeting minutes. I trust that the members have all had an opportunity to review both sets of minutes. Any proposed modifications or changes to the minutes from the special meeting? Hearing none is...
I just had one question, really for George. From the regular meeting, when we were talking about the daycare, or the at Grace United Methodist Church, I was a little confused in the minutes when it was talking about fencing. You had been asking about fencing. Did you require fencing, or you just were suggesting that they might want to talk about fencing? Because it seemed to go both ways in the minutes.
Yeah, I thought that the minutes reflected what we discussed. I had suggested that the applicant include fencing in there when they go forward to the village board. And I think that's the way the motion read.
You read that, okay.
So I was comfortable with it.
Okay, I was just a little confused with the language, so, good, okay, thanks.
All right. Thank you, Member Fisher. Any other proposed revisions on either set of minutes?
I just had a couple of typos. I'll just hand them off.
Great.
Is Member Toll? Well, we can proceed. All right. Is there a motion to approve both sets of minutes? Is there a second? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Agenda item number 4, comprehensive land use plan, missing middle housing presentation. And Ms. Gable will give an overview and then we'll get started. Kind of incorporated them into both. I think Deb was commenting on the regular, and so we just, good, thank you.
Yeah. So to provide some background on this presentation that Jennifer Settle will be giving with Opticos, late last year, the village initiated a procurement process to retain professional planning services to help update the village's existing 1997 comprehensive plan with a new document and framework to guide development and land use decisions for the next 20 years. The new plan will provide an overarching framework and prioritize elements from the numerous sub-area and topical plans created by the village since the adoption of the 1997 comprehensive plan. 4 proposals were submitted by the January deadline, plus 1 alternative non-conforming proposal, and a consultant selection team was assembled, which included PCZBA Chair Gary Peters, PCZBA member Ann Sorensen, BAC member and local architect and developer Rob Douglas, School District 65 board member and historic preservation architect Tim Penich, Assistant Village Attorney Ben Schuster, Administrative Intern Eric Mueller, and Village Administrator Drew Irvin. After evaluating the proposals and interviewing the top 3 firms, it was the consensus of the team that Tesca Associates stood out as the most qualified firm in how their proposal, interview, and references demonstrated their understanding of the work to be performed, quality work of a similar nature, strong technical skills, clear satisfaction of clients, familiarity with Lake Bluff, and efficient cost approach to completing the scope of work. And the consultant selection team also believed that engaging an additional firm, Opticos Design, presented a unique opportunity to address long-standing village strategic objectives to encourage diverse housing implementation for residents in all stages of life and engage the entire community in the village leadership's examination of a variety of quality housing options in the context of Lake Bluff's historic housing legacy and the marketplace. The team agreed that Opticos' housing diversity expertise could augment the larger comprehensive plan update within Tesca's robustly planned community engagement process. Updating the comprehensive land use plan takes approximately 14 months. Key areas for the revised plan include economic development, housing, transportation and infrastructure, sustainability and resiliency, stormwater and infrastructure, and implementation. And after our consultants were engaged originally in April 2023, much progress has been made, such as the project kickoff meeting that was held on May 19th with village staff and consultants, Tesca and Opticos. After that, there was a kickoff meeting that was held at the July 13th PCZBA meeting. Since then, Tesca has set up a dedicated project website, lakebluffplan.org, and has established that, which includes a community survey and mapping tool. They've attended a pop-up event on August 18th at the Lake Bluff Farmers Market, and they also did an existing conditions report that was reviewed by the PCZBA at their last meeting on September 20th. And then most recently, Tesca is wrapping up their due diligence phase and has completed around 20 interviews with community stakeholders, and more of those are in the works. And as you may know, tonight's meeting is focused on the housing section of the comprehensive land use plan. More specifically, the village's consultant, Opticos, will provide a missing middle housing presentation as part of the comprehensive land use plan update process. The presentation will run about 1 hour and be followed by a Q&A session. All right, Jennifer, if you want to step up.
Thank you for that. All right, and you're going to progress the slides,
I
right?
will, yes. So
Perfect.
just if you want to give me a nod or let me know, I can push those forward.
That sounds good. You can hear me okay? Well, thank you so much for having me again here tonight. Jennifer Settle, Senior Associate and lead of the Chicago office of Opticos Design. As Clara sort of noted, we are an urban planning and design company that's passionate about enabling missing middle housing and creating walkable, sustainable neighborhoods through architecture, zoning, and planning. This presentation, right, is the beginning of an effort to study missing middle housing in Lake Bluff as part of that comprehensive plan update led by the wonderful Tesca Associates. So we'll try to build a little bit on last month's presentation of the existing conditions report. But today, next slide, we're really going to focus on this idea of enabling more housing choices. So missing middle housing includes a range of house-scale buildings that just so happen to have multiple units inside of them. These include types like the duplex, the cottage court, or a fourplex. Opticos coined the term in 2010 and has since been working to support these types of housing in communities across the country. In 2020, our founder, Dan Froelich, wrote the seminal book on the topic. Next slide, thanks. Before I could have told you what missing middle really meant, I lived in many of these types, from a backyard garage cottage to a small courtyard apartment. And now, as I spent the last 15 years really studying these types, I can identify some of the unique benefits that are tied to these different building forms. It's this variety of housing that provides the needed choices to meet people at different stages of life, different income levels, and interest in different communities. Next. The goal of today's presentation is really simply to start the conversation on why we need this type of housing, then define what is and what is not missing middle, and then look at some of the common barriers and some solutions. Right? So the hope is to start to identify what types and tools might work best in Lake Bluff to enable more housing choice. Right? And then we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, for lots of questions and discussions. Before we get into the characteristics, I want to highlight some of the reasons why this variety of housing is so important to prioritize. Right? We know that our housing markets of every size are seeing some unprecedented shifts. 1/3 of households are now single persons, right? So if you look around your community, do you feel that 30% of the housing has been designed to meet the needs of that group of people, right? No community that we worked in has really kept up with that shift. The next one always shocks me, right? Very soon, in most of our communities across the country, 75 to 85% of households will not have children within them. So even in Lake Bluff, where the percentage is much lower there than the national or county averages, more than half of your households do not have children. So we need to be thinking differently about the standard housing that we're providing. The last one I'll highlight is that by 2030, 1 in every 5 people in the U.S. will be over 65. Nearly 20% of Lake Bluff is over 65 currently, and this is why groups like the ARP have really become one of the biggest advocates of missing middle housing and concepts like accessory dwelling units. At the same time those demographics are shifting, there's this tremendous mismatch between what the market wants and what we've been providing over the course of the last 30 or even 40 years. Right? There's a growing demand for housing types that are more walkable, and this is primarily driven by 2 groups. So nearly 60% of millennials and 30% of baby boomers are looking for smaller, middle-scale housing types. And they're looking for them in places where they can walk to a grocery store or school or to get a cup of coffee, right? Under that 3 stories with places to interact with your neighbor on the street and with nature, right? This is exactly what makes Lake Bluff so appealing. But we know less than 10% of all housing units produced in the last couple of decades were middle scale. So for the purposes of this graph, we mean buildings that house between 2 and 19 units. Right? We all know that when there's pent-up demand and low supply, right, it equates to really high prices. Next. But we once knew how to deliver more of that middle-scale housing within our neighborhoods. So this is a Sears catalog from the 1920s where you could buy these stock homes, right, including things like a fourplex. You could order it and get it shipped to your nearest railroad station, hire a contractor to pick it up and build the kit. Pretty amazing. These fit on regular sized neighborhood lots and had tons of character, right? A really desirable housing solution. Next. This group probably knows shortly after most of those buildings were built in the early 1930s or 40s, zoning was put in place, right? Our cities and our towns started regulating by use and designating larger swaths of land for single-family housing only. Because of that zoning, much of our cities became exclusionary, meaning they're only available for those that could afford a single-family house. The vast majority of our communities across the country limit most of their land to only a single-family house, and with that, we lost some of that housing choice that those Sears catalog and missing middle types of building provided naturally. So in Lake Bluff, nearly all of the land that you have zoned for residential uses only permits a single-family house. And while more and more people are asking for walkable environments and different housing choices, it's also becoming imperative for both environmental and economic reasons, right? Building near our walkable core, near transit, and within existing infrastructure can help protect our open space and agricultural lands. There are also economic reasons, including better tax revenue through more efficient use of land and lower infrastructure costs per household. But as I'll show, that financial and environmental sustainability doesn't have to mean big mid-rise apartment buildings, right? We can be part of a housing solution that still fosters wonderful, beloved, low-rise and walkable neighborhoods. So if we look closer at Lake Bluff, 50% of your land area is zoned for residential. The rest is zoned for open space, commercial, and industrial. We'll dive into this a little bit more later in the presentation, but the only district that allows anything more than a single-family house by right is your CBD district, right? Comprising of just 0.2% of your land area. It makes sense, you see here in those red circles, right, that it's focused around the heart of your community, but it certainly isn't putting a dent in that housing diversity. Next. So we definitely see the limitations that zoning starts to set, but let's go back to some of those demographic shifts, right? This slide highlights many of the same insights that we saw in the existing conditions presentation that Teska did last month, but we want to review them here a little bit differently. 52% of households have someone over the age of 60. 17% of households are single persons, with over half of that amount being over 65. Two-person households make up an even larger percentage at 39%. You also have a very high homeownership rate with 91% homeowners, notably higher than Lake County, which makes sense when we start to dive into the median income levels, right, at $173,000. Breaking that down a little bit further, we look at 88% of residents make over $75,000. Both of those numbers are significantly higher than Lake County. However, when you jump to the last one, you do have 25% of residents who would consider cost burden, meaning the households pay more than 30% of their income on housing, just slightly lower but more in line with Lake County percentages. Next. So those are your demographics, and now let's look a little bit closer at the data about your housing market. Right? 80% of your housing was built between 1940 and 1999. You have a low vacancy rate, and 96% of existing housing is comprised of single-unit buildings. So the chart on the right breaks down the number of units that you have within different building types. Right? This aligns with what we saw in your zoning. The majority of multifamily units that you do have are located in those couple of blocks that make up your CBD. Primarily, though, I'll point to the bottom row where I want us to look at that median home value and median rents, which are double what we find in Lake County. Next slide. This paints a pretty good picture, right? You have high median incomes that align with those higher price points of homes. That all makes sense, right? But when we dive into that a little bit more to understand what a household making your median income of $173,000 can afford to rent or purchase, it starts to tell us a piece of that story, right? If we do some quick math, right, assuming a 30-year mortgage, 10% down, and a fairly optimistic interest rate of 7%, we see that the median Lake Bluff household can afford to buy a home for $550,000, right? That seems pretty good until we start to realize that number is more than $100,000 less than the median home value of Lake Bluff currently. Next slide. And we know, right, that sales prices are even higher, with the cost of housing continuing to rise, right? The two things to note here, in addition to the high price to buy in Lake Bluff, are the low inventory and the difference in sale price between detached versus attached products, right? It's important to note here, this is of course a very limited snapshot of data from just the past couple of years, and there were very few sales, right, to even look at. But the key point is one that I think we all recognize: housing of all kinds, right, is becoming more expensive. Diversifying your housing stock could create options for a wider range of income levels. Using the same math, right, we know housing in Lake Bluff is out of reach for many that work or want to live in your community, from your teachers, police officers, nurses, and local baristas. Next slide. The big takeaway, right, is that there's this need to accommodate more housing and better meet the needs of people living in Lake Bluff. Right? You're seeing a growing percentage of seniors and single-person households, and we should be providing housing choices that better meet those changing needs. Next slide. This is why we are here, right? Addressing this need for housing diversity is based off the call within your strategic plan, adopted by your community, to encourage that diversity of housing for residents in all stages of life. This is really the heart, the sole purpose of the Missing Middle study, and we're grateful to be here to look at this. Having that conversation about missing middle is not going to guarantee, right, you get more housing, but it's an important first step for the village to try and answer this community's call, right, on that topic. So we want to start to figure out what types are needed, where they might be appropriate, and then identify some strategies that can help deliver on these goals. Next slide. Thank you. Missing middle is a key part of creating a housing strategy that better serves your residents, right? So as we dive into that conversation, let's think about what types are needed in your community and who is your housing serving, right? Are we talking about a fourplex that can provide desired options for young professionals that might want or need to live with a roommate? Or a townhouse or duplex for divorcees or young professionals, or for divorcees or small families, right, that don't want a large house? We hear all the time from boomers and seniors that they still want that independent house, but would prefer a smaller single-story option, right? And then, of course, the need for more starter homes for young families or carriage houses that might provide for aging parents that want or need to be close to their family. It's this variety of housing that welcomes residents in all stages of life and allows people to age in place in a community that they clearly love. Next slide. All right, so with all that in mind, let's dive into the important characteristics and types of missing middle. Right, we want to be clear here, it isn't just about allowing multifamily housing. Next slide. Once again, these are house-scale buildings that have multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. Over the course of the last 80 years, we've really set up our financial systems, our planning, our policy, our development industry with single-family detached houses in mind, what you see over there on the left. At the other end, we have those 5, 6, 7-story condos and apartment buildings. In the last couple of decades, we've created systems to deliver that bigger scale of housing and make it economically viable. But for all these types in the middle, we really don't have the systems in place to deliver them very easily. Next slide. That's why we call it missing, right? We can really boil the majority of our housing development into just 2 choices for housing. Right? More recently, we've added townhouses to that mix. Right? This goes back to those statistics of 96% of Lake Bluff's housing is in single-unit homes. 93% of that is detached, 3% is attached, like you would see in the townhouses. And I think most of us can agree, right, those mid-rise and the high-rise apartments are pretty out of scale with Lake Bluff's character. Next slide. I'm going to say this probably a couple more times at least, but the most important factor of missing middle is that they're compatible with the scale and form of a house. Next. It shouldn't just be about getting more units on a lot. The form is the really critical part of missing middle. So this is an example of a triplex, 3 units built to look like a single-family house. The second part, next slide, is that they're more attainable to middle-income households. So we often call this affordable by design. And when we say that, next slide, we mean they're designed to work on your typical infill lots and use smaller units in buildings that can lower those land costs and be built incrementally over time. This is particularly important for a village like Lake Bluff that has high land costs. Next slide. I do want to be clear, right? Missing middle is not a guarantee of affordability. Right? We really started to use these 3 criteria for evaluating the results of our work. 1, is it feasible? Right? It has to make economic sense for developers and builders to build it. 2, is it attainable? Right? Are the homes being delivered at a size and type that can achieve reasonable priced homes in your market? And 3, right? Are these types offering quality living and contributing to a place that is desirable to live? Right? that livability. Next slide. When implemented thoughtfully, right, Missing Middle can increase rental options through small-scale multifamily housing. It can offer smaller, more attainable starter homes, as well as add units on existing lots to help offset some of those housing costs for existing homeowners. These types, of course, have historically existed in cities across the country, from Michigan, next, to Chicago, the middle one's in my neighborhood, right? But everywhere, that's like my next one, sorry, no, you're fine. Everywhere we go, right, we find a similar catalog of building types adopted to local climate and culture. The styles can certainly be different, but the types are pretty much the same. And unless you're looking really closely at water meters or mailboxes, they're embedded into predominantly single-family home neighborhoods without really standing out. Next slide. When we look at Lake Bluff, if you remember from the previous slide, most of your housing stock was built a little bit later than Missing Middle's rise in the 1940s to 1999. But you still have a range of multifamily types. These are primarily located near your downtown. Next. And you definitely have a wonderful history of small lots and cottages, right? Harkening back to those founding of your village with the Lake Bluff Camp Association in the late 1800s. The character and scale of Lake Bluff is one that cannot be underestimated. I know I don't need to tell this group that, but that's an important factor in any future housing strategies. Next slide. All right, so let's review the range of building types that we generally include in Missing Middle. Within the palette of Missing Middle types, there's a range from small, medium to large, and each of these groups fit within different environments. So as we go through these types, I want you to be thinking about which ones might make most sense, might be most appropriate in your community. For Lake Bluff, right, we were mostly talking about these small and medium groups that maintain that 2.5 story house scale. Next slide. But we'll start with the duplex. The stacked duplex is 2 units on top of each other. Next. Or you can have the side-by-side version with a shared wall. The owner can often rent the second unit to generate income or use it to provide housing for a family member. Next. In either configuration, the critical factor with the Missing Middle duplex is that they fit in the same building footprint and the same form as a typical house, which maintains that rear yard and fits on a typical neighborhood lot. Next thing. Cottage courts are made up of a few or more small detached homes oriented around a shared courtyard or green. These are quickly becoming one of the most highly sought after housing types for downsizing boomers, first-time home buyers, and single-person households who really want that smaller detached home, but to also be part of a community, right? The unfortunate part is these are illegal in most communities that we go to, including yours. Next slide. Most of our zoning regulations and our development incentives discourage building small products, but that, of course, is what is most needed in our current market. Townhouses, as I mentioned, are one of those largest growing types of new housing built in the last decade, right? They're really appealing to developers because they can be financed with a conventional single-family mortgage and sold as fee-simple lots. We do have to be careful when allowing or encouraging townhouses. They're certainly adding to the supply, which could be a good thing, but they're not delivering much in terms of attainability, right? And often result in some problematic forms. So if you allow tuck-under parking, this is what developers will build all day long, right? But the form and the site planning here is not really creating good walkable environments, right? So we want to enhance walkability and think about how we can allow these attached types, but in a way that might help enhance their attainability at the same time. The next type I'll highlight is one that I really wish we would start enabling in most of our communities. A triplex or a fourplex starts to take the shape of that grander house, but contains 4 smaller units. Few of these have been built due to code and financing obstacles in the last couple of decades. Once you pass that 3 units or more threshold, you're working with the much stricter international building code, and you typically have to use commercial financing, right? Again, next slide, we are talking about 4 smaller units within the same building footprint, right? Not cramming 4 larger houses on a lot. It's an important distinction to make in your zoning. Next slide. Moving up, we're getting to that upper end, right? A smaller multiplex can have up 5 to 8 units. The key here is really that scale. We're still well below that 3 stories and sticking with the residential house character. Next slide. And finally, the last one I'll note here is the courtyard apartment, which of course provides that community and shared space and can allow for some wonderful landscaping and trees. These start to jump up in scale, so we typically want to make sure we're being really cognizant and sensitive to where these are allowed. Next slide. The key takeaway is that each of these types have an intended form, right? Not all missing middle types are appropriate for every neighborhood, but we want to start identifying which types make sense and where you might encourage them to happen. All right, so let's go through some of the most important characteristics to think about when regulating or advocating for missing middle. First, these types perform best when they're in a walkable context. Okay, people are willing to make trade-offs in order to live in a great neighborhood. Trade-offs on space or size, in order to live in a great neighborhood or be close to transit. That does not have to mean urban or downtown living. It's really about what can we walk or bike to within our neighborhood. And of course, additional housing can play an important role in supporting local services and mobility choices, right? So gentle density that missing middle can provide is really about keeping those small neighborhood businesses and downtowns viable. Again, the most important factor of missing middle is that they're compatible with the scale and form of a single house. Next. We're talking about width, depth, and height, right? Missing middle is under that 2.5 story. So if we think about the same size box on a standard size infill lot, it might have 1 big house, it might have 2, 3, or 4 smaller units inside of it. This allows for that adaptability to meet those changing households' needs. Along the same lines, missing middle typically consists of smaller, well-designed units that provide choices for all ages and ability. Again, allowing for that adaptability to provide for individual needs like accessibility. So we aren't talking about the size of a tiny house, right? But their sweet spot is really that 1 to 2 bedroom unit that responds to those demographic shifts that we talked about earlier. Parking is often one of the main concerns and one of the barriers that comes up again and again in our missing middle work. It often feels like we're better at housing cars than people. When implementing missing middle in walkable or older neighborhoods especially, there are just physical constraints that limit the amount of parking that you can get on a lot. And all that space that we're dedicating to parking gets expensive, and that cost is passed on to the buyer or the renter. One of the really unique distinctions of missing middle is that it creates a sense of community within the building and within the neighborhood. Often provide shared spaces, both internally and externally, right? This is an important aspect, especially given the growing number of single-person households that still want to be a part of a community, but live in a place that feels like their own. All right, finally, because of that focus on smaller units in house scale buildings, missing middle can be built with the same simple construction methods and often the same financing as your typical house. Next. This means both smaller developers and local trades can execute them. So when we talk about the affordability of missing middle, we aren't talking about capital A affordable. Missing middle typically reaches that 80% to 120% AMI. Next. Just as important as understanding the characteristics that make missing middle successful, we also want to identify the barriers that prevent it from getting built. Unfortunately, that list is pretty long, and we need to be tackling these issues from several different angles. So I won't go into all of these in details today, but I'll highlight a few, right? Our zoning codes are often non-starters for new types of housing. There's simply a lack of zoning districts that enable missing middle. And even when your zoning district might allow that small multifamily, we typically find other regulations or the entitlement process that make them impractical to build. Our development and our financial industries aren't always aligned or familiar with some of these types. right? And we know financing and cost of construction is a huge barrier, especially in areas that have high land cost. Our building codes, number 4, often place unintentional costs on smaller projects. So this can include things like sprinklers, elevators, sewer and water tap. These items all add up, right, when you can't spread that cost out over many, many units, right, 20 or 50 or more. And then finally, the last one, we often see neighborhood resistance to multifamily buildings of any kind or size, right? It takes some really hard conversations to work through some of the misconceptions that exist around multifamily, around rental housing. In our work, we've really learned to frame the conversation away from trigger terms like density, right, like upzoning or multifamily. And we found more success in talking about the more important factors, right, like form and housing type and the people that want or need these choices. Overcoming these barriers, it often starts with fixing our zoning, right? That's why we're here. But the key takeaway is that that is just the first step. We also need to begin recruiting local developers to deliver these types, and we need to rebuild the infrastructure to support them from planning all the way through financing. I do want to dive a little bit deeper and highlight a few of the regulatory barriers that we often see in our work and in most zoning codes that we encounter. Right? Multifamily development standards don't differentiate between scales. Zoning really needs to articulate what type of building you want to achieve. So the building on the left here is 6 units. It fits in most neighborhoods. It's what we would call house scale. The building on the right is 24 units, but it's quite a bit different, right? We should not be regulating 2 or 4 unit buildings the same way we do a much larger building that takes up an entire block or more, right? But our zoning sees these two things as the same. Right? So it's kind of understandable that people push back on multifamily zoning, right, when the physical outcomes are not clearly defined. Similar situation with parking. We find parking regulations that aren't calibrated for existing lot sizes or context. So zoning typically sets required minimum number of parking spaces regardless of lot size. So if we look at this image on the left here, right, we can automatically tell that the parking regulations require so much parking that a developer has to consolidate multiple lots to be able to meet those minimums, right? This can have a couple of pretty serious impacts, right? 1, it starts to erode your tax base. 2, it really hurts the walkability of a place. And 3, it can add significant cost if it requires a developer to buy multiple lots just to build the one building, right? As opposed to the smaller, let's go back to, sorry, almost done, thanks. The image on the right, could be providing smaller housing options, but they often aren't feasible because they can't physically provide enough parking to meet the zoning standards. Thanks. The final regulation that I'll highlight is FAR, right? Floor area ratio. This is a typical performance metric found in most zoning codes, including yours, that calculates how much total floor area can be provided on a site. However, right, the results can be pretty unpredictable. So in this example, however extreme it may be, these two outcomes have the same FAR, right, but dramatically different outcomes. Your FAR is obviously a lot smaller, right? It ranges from 0.2 to 0.4. But the point is that our zoning standards should be clear about the physical outcomes it wants to see, and the tools that we're currently using are not delivering on that predictability. Next. So let's talk more specifically about zoning in Lake Bluff. So this is your current zoning map. As part of our work, we'll be analyzing some of your existing zoning regulations, and I want to quickly touch on some of the tools and some of the initial barriers that we find. For reference, those circles represent a 1/4 mile and a 1/2 mile radius, right, around downtown. That's indicative of a 5 and a 10-minute walk. So the little bit of yellow within the first circle is your CBD zoning, and the darker blue just north of that indicates your R5 zoning. Those are the 2 primary zones we'll be looking at in the missing middle study. The first barrier is one that I kind of touched on in the beginning, right? But you do not have zones that allow anything other than a single-family house, right? Multi-unit structures of any kind are only permitted by right in the CBD district. When we look at your residential districts, you can go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. You have 9 residential zones, right? In this chart, they generally go from least intense at the top to the more intense at the bottom, and yet none of these allow multifamily until you jump to that CBD. Next. Some of you, I hope, are wondering about your R5 zoning district, right? On the zoning map, it's clearly marked as your multifamily zone, right? And a topic that I see frequently in past notes from the PCZBA meetings, right, discusses this need for multifamily or alternative housing options. And most of those conversations revolved around the effectiveness of your R5 zoning, right? That includes 30 parcels adjacent to your CBD. But once you start to look at the actual standards for R5, no multi-unit types are permitted, right? There are also several other standards that do start to encourage smaller lot development, right, and indicate that it was setting up for multifamily, but they need to be better calibrated for your typical lot sizes and for missing middle types. Next. The problem really comes when we look closer at your allowed use table, right? We found that multi-unit uses are not allowed in any residential zone, including R5, right? There's that one indication at the bottom of this chart that multifamily in the form of residential condos are allowed, but only by special use, right? So this concept of by right zoning is really important, and it's one we'll get into a bit more in a couple minutes. But it's just important to understand that R5 is your highest intensity residential zone, and the only thing allowed by right without special exception is single family. In fact, that's the only thing allowed by right in any zone outside of your CBD, right? So the key barrier there on the last slide, sorry, this is affecting your ability to provide that housing diversity that the strategic plan calls for. Next slide, please. Lake Bluff is a single-family community, so that might be what was intended with the zoning. But when we look at the regulations, R5 and even the much more prevalent R4 district doesn't even allow those small cottages or original camp houses to be built today, right, on your standard size Lake Bluff lots. So most of your historic neighborhood lots are about 50 to 60 feet wide and 120 feet deep, right? But you have regulations that clearly state no building shall be erected on any lot less than 7,500 square feet, right? So you can't even build in the same pattern.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you?
Yes, please.
That's categorically incorrect.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Any lot that's individually owned, even if it's 25 feet wide and only 2,000 foot in square foot size, is allowed to build a single family home on that lot.
Is it? Okay,
Yes.
That's why we
So
have
don't-
this conversation.
yeah, don't-
No, this is
And I think most people on our board understand that, but I don't want the public.
No,
That
that's
shouldn't
great.
go out to the
And that's
public.
why I hope we have
Yeah.
lots of time for question and commentary, because
Okay.
we haven't done any of our recommendations, our work, right? We're in the analysis phase. And so those are the things when we come in as an outsider and look at your zoning code and we see things like this, we want to call attention because they could be read incorrectly, right? And that's always a good response when we hear, no, you're wrong. We have fixed that, or we have addressed that, or we have a work for that, right? But we look at zoning codes, we look at a lot of zoning codes in the country, and we try to find these things, right, that are out of whack, that don't align with the goals that you've stated to us. So I appreciate that, and that's one of the things that we want. That's why we're talking about these things, right? We want to get it straight and understand what are the intentions of your zoning code and make sure that the regulations align with that. So that's a fair enough. All right, next one. Outside of what we call your base zones, right, but the ones you see at the top here, you do have some additional tools that allow some more flexibility and potentially could open up possibilities for more housing choice. So there are 3 tools that show up as allowing something other than a single-family house, even if only by special use. So these include accessory dwelling units, planned mixed-use developments, and planned residential developments. We're going to start with the planned residential development, and again, these are just touch points to try to get a sense of what tools you have and where the barriers might be. I think you guys are all probably familiar with this one, but it's used for sites with 6 or more acres or 10 or more dwelling units. The intent is to allow development that's in line with the various unique environments around the village and give you that flexibility in development standards. But it does still rely on the uses that are allowed in your base zoning, so it's fairly limited, right? And the regulations tend to promote very large sites on the outskirts of town that don't necessarily promote walkability, right? When we see these larger setbacks and things like that. However, this is certainly a tool that could be considered for some of those cottage court types, right? If the standards were refined to support that smaller product. The next one we want to explore is the PMD tool. Next slide. This was created specifically for creative approaches to mixed-use development and to promote more efficient use of land, especially around your CBD. Right? In short, it allows some of the adjacent R4 and R5 sites to follow rules set by the CBD. So this is really promising, right? Since the CBD is that zone that allows those multifamily uses. This is one that we'll be testing in our work, right? But it's important to note that some of the standards are kind of unclear, right? What does adequate parking mean? It could mean different things to different people. And in some cases, at first glance, right, the standards are more restrictive than the base zoning. So in R4, we see a height limit of 34 feet, right? The PMD limits that to 30 feet or 2 stories. And similar to the PRD, it still requires a special use process, right? So these are some of those things we want to get to the root of what their intent is and make sure that the regulations are all aligning with your goals for those zoning tools. Next one, the final tool we want to make note of are efforts to allow accessory dwelling units. So this provision allows internal or detached units to be added to a single-family dwelling. The standards are all fairly straightforward and really reasonable. However, we know that these types are really hard to finance and get built, right? They're extremely expensive on a cost per square foot basis. So people typically need a very personal reason for building them. And most often they're built for private use or for a close relative. Right, so we've learned in our work that any sort of red tape or extra requirements like the parking or common ownership make them very unlikely to get built. In sum, right, these tools can all be really helpful, but they all require this special use permit and process, right? Most communities use this added level of discretionary review for good reason, right? Because they don't have the tools or the limits in place that provide those predictable outcomes, especially when it comes to form and scale, right? But the trouble is that this process can add really significant time and cost, right? It also opens it up to a lot of public review. That often ends up derailing most projects, especially small-scale ones that really can't handle that long, drawn-out or expensive entitlement process. All right, we got through the zoning. I know that's the tough one for people to get through, but we're going to move on to the more positive part, right? I want to highlight a few case studies and tools that start to emphasize the wide range of ways that communities are overcoming these types of barriers and implementing missing middle. Fortunately, in our work, we found some really innovative developers that are willing to stick out that zoning process and prove the success of these housing types. So I'm going to start with this example of a for-sale cottage court. This is in Northern California. And it has 12 total units. So there's 8 2-bed and 2-bathroom units, and then 4 smaller ADUs. They're organized around a shared community green along with several other smaller open spaces, and it's located really close to this community's downtown. The takeaway here is that even in one of the most expensive markets in the country, right, they were able to reduce the sale cost from a typical $500 per square foot for single-family homes in this particular city down to $300 per square foot. Right? That's still expensive, but it's significantly different than the status quo. All of these units were recently sold and occupied. Next. Next one I just wanted to show is a cottage court done by some of our colleagues at Union Studio for a developer in Rhode Island. For the next project I'd like to highlight is located on a large property just southwest of Omaha, Nebraska. The first phase delivered 132 units, which are currently built and occupied, and the next 100 are in progress. In total, there'll be over 700 units on 50 acres of land, right? That's a substantial greenfield site that created all new blocks and streets. It's not necessarily something that's appropriate in every town, but the interesting thing is that it's entirely rental housing, right? So the developer typically did larger garden-style apartment complex, but he came to us and said, I want to do something different. So rather than one multifamily complex, it's delivering it as a neighborhood made up of smaller missing middle types, including townhouses, carriage houses, and up to 8-unit buildings. And the city and the developer is really proud that they're able to deliver a choice of new units, right, at different price points that didn't exist in the community previously. Next. On this side, you can see the different number of units in each building here. One of the things that made this project successful that I think is necessary to talk about is how the developer approached parking, right? In order to create that sense of community, he recognized that he couldn't have big parking lots or predominantly all tuck under parking along the street, right? So even though this is a really suburban location, and people definitely needed their cars, most of them too, right? He took an approach that every unit had one garage spot and the rest was on street. Now, notably, this project would not have been able to be achieved if the city hadn't first made sure their regulations allowed it. But this project has dramatically shifted the conversation in this community about what multifamily housing can look like. The final case study I want to highlight is just outside Salt Lake City in Daybreak, Utah. A local single-family builder approached Opticos with an interest in providing new housing options that were within reach of first-time home buyers, right? Something that the builder had been struggling to deliver. It was a really quirky site, but we were able to create a new housing type situated around a walkable public muse. And the result was a more attainable suite of homes that ranged from 960 square feet to 1,400 square foot townhouses that provided this desirable amenity both inside and out, and these ended up selling for about $20,000 less than the previous entry-level options. Next. All right, so how does a community get to those built products, right? There's no one-size-fits-all approach, but I do want to highlight a few of these in more details, right? Because it can really start with pretty simple steps like walking tours or the presentation today that start this conversation and build support before you approach more robust efforts like zoning updates or a regional toolkit, right? Or even pilot projects. Next slide. Many communities we work in start by doing just this, right? Identifying the barriers in their zoning. And this process often includes graphically testing the zoning code to understand what your regulations are actually encouraging, and then identifying what would have to change to allow different missing middle types. These tests can help identify particularly problematic regulations, as well as help understand what missing middle types best fit on your existing lot sizes in your community, right? So this visualization often starts to open the door for incremental changes to your zoning. Next. This is an example of incremental zoning changes from South Bend, Indiana, not too far away, right? The city recognized that their current ordinance was not achieving the community's desired goals of walkable neighborhoods and that diverse housing, right? So they set out on a course of neighborhood planning followed by small amendments to their zoning code that would better encourage neighborhood infill. They eliminated off-street parking in some locations before doing it citywide. They allowed ADUs by right and calibrated their existing regulations to local conditions, particularly studying how missing middle fit on different lot sizes in their community. Right? In the first 18 months after adoption of the new zoning ordinance, the city saw a jump in approved processes, approved projects, while the annual number of rezoning and special exceptions and variance requests dropped by 66%. Next. The zoning code removed the existing regulatory barriers, but the cost to build and appraise new units was still really tough to pencil out. So the city continued to look at innovative ways of lowering the cost to deliver these new types of housing, right? So they're now offering, what you see here, pre-approved building plans for types like cottages, right, carriage houses, and duplexes. And along with this is a tax abatement program for new home construction citywide. These incentives have been a key step in encouraging smaller missing middle housing types to get built, like the two you see on the bottom there that are currently under construction. Next. Zoning changes can also just be targeted at new growth areas. So South Bend focused on their sort of inner urban infill lots. This is an example from Iowa City, where they created zoning that enabled missing middle in a more underutilized portion of town. And the new zoning, which was implemented by a vision plan, was really championed in a large part by the mayor, right? He was the primary reason that the city prioritized missing middle. And now this area, which is called the South District, is being developed with more innovative housing choices, right? That meet sort of their demographic needs that they had identified early on. Next. In other communities, right, zoning changes wasn't quite on the table yet, and instead they took approach of starting with pilot projects, right? This can be an effective way to test potential zoning changes before trying to get them adopted more broadly. Often this can be done on city or village-owned land, right? So as was the case in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where the city provided gap financing to build a duplex and a carriage house in partnership with a nonprofit housing developer, right? And their goal there was really to support zoning changes that are now underway. With each of these examples, it was really important to visualize what missing middle types fit within the character and scale of existing neighborhoods, using typical lot sizes or real opportunity sites within the community. It's this visualization that helps build support for new housing choices that might be outside what is currently allowed. Finally, the most critical thing, next slide, thanks, you can do is start advocating for housing that meets the need of your population. Right? The more we talk about and understand these building types, the more opportunity we have to reduce community resistance and build support for that housing diversity. Next. So what might the next steps in Lake Bluff look like? Right? The goal of this study is to help identify housing strategies that could be included in your comp plan with guidance on where that might be appropriate. We'll also be testing your R5 and your CBD regulations to understand how they could better support missing middle housing types. And finally, we'll examine some opportunity sites to test out and visualize those potential opportunities for missing middle. Next. The opportunity sites that have been identified by the village include ones you're really familiar with, right? Block 1 and Block 3. These will test out some of those zoning standards for CBD and R5, as well as some of those tools like the PMD district, right? And it'll help visualize what missing middle could mean for these sites. This isn't the first time this issue has been tackled. If you remember, I don't know how many years ago, 7, 8 years ago, right? There was a missing middle competition for this site to generate ideas of what could happen on this site, what the community could get behind, and what that looked like from a program, right, and capacity. All important things. Next slide. We'll also be testing a larger site. So this one is Crabtree Farm, right, just north of Blodgett Road. These studies will help to understand tools like your PRD and visualize what missing middle scenarios might be appropriate for areas located a little bit outside of your downtown, but that can also help provide housing diversity near key amenities like the lakefront. Next. These sites, of course, will give guidance on housing, right, as well as the future land use map for the comprehensive plan update that TESCA is working on. Next slide. All right, promise I'm wrapping things up, but we want to go back to the basics, right? While we really need to move the needle on housing diversity, we want to prioritize that form and scale that's so important in Lake Bluff. Next. In order to build a community that supports more housing options, we have to frame the conversation about who these housing choices are providing for, right? We need housing for our aging population, for young professionals, options for downsizing boomers or single-person households, and of course, starter homes for young families. The only way we can move past some of the pushback that we see is to go back to that why, back to the conversation about shifting demographics and the needs of those that live and work in your community. Next slide. Missing middle is just one tool in the toolbox, right? But it's desperately needed to help address those housing issues and deliver choices that meet the needs of our changing demographics. Next. Finally, I want to end with the reason we're all here, right? To really take those next steps on following through with the goal to encourage diverse housing for residents in all stages of life. So with that, I'll open it up for questions and discussions. I hope to get lots of your feedback on where we went right, where we were wrong, what resonated, and start to have a conversation of what missing middle might look like in Lake Bluff. Thank you so much.
Just to start, can I get a real quick clarity in my own mind on your definition of middle housing? Because when I walked in here, I thought for sure it was going to talk about price. And
Yeah.
you very clearly said at the beginning that, no, it means 2 units or more under one roof. And it seems that you haven't classified all of our subdivisions as middle housing. I'm wondering why Oak Knoll and Armor Woods and the Sanctuary, there's probably 275 dwelling units between, and maybe you don't know all 3 of those subdivisions.
Vaguely, but yeah.
Because the numbers don't wash with, the numbers you calculated, so I'm wondering
Yeah.
if you're counting those. And if you're not, why are they not under your definitions? Why are
Yeah.
they not middle housing? And then I'm wondering if staff, or if you've seen our Wimbledon Court subdivision, where there were a whole series of single-family, I don't know if you call them cottages, maybe a little
Yeah.
bit bigger, but if you're aware of that area, and if you would think that that would classify, because you did show some cottages that you seem to imply would be
Yeah.
classified as middle housing if they were all served off of a court.
Yeah, fair.
So
No, that's-
I just want to,
No, I
as the
appreciate that,
discussion
actually.
evolves forward and we're using the term middle housing, I want to get clear in my own mind if Armor Woods, Oak Knoll, and the Sanctuary are middle housing,
Fair
or
enough.
if you're discounting them because of whatever reason you're discounting them, because
Yeah.
they seem to fit your definition of middle housing.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I think there's a couple of things to clarify and unpack there. The first one being, yes, missing middle has taken on a life of its own, and there's sort of varying definitions, right? Our zoning codes typically don't define exactly what middle housing is, right? So there's 2 different things going on. The way we talk about and define missing middle is twofold, right? And so I think there were some slides in the beginning. First and foremost, it's the form and scale of a house, right? That happens to have multiple units inside of it, right? So it's a scale that fits on typical size lots in your community that happen to have multiple units in it, right? That's middle housing. I think there's also, and aligned with those efforts, but not necessarily falling within missing middle, is smaller lot, single-family homes and cottages, as well as things like accessory dwelling units, right, that have one single unit in a smaller footprint. They meet and share many of the same characteristics, but are typically outside of the definition that we would say for missing middle. The reason cottage courts are stored within that as a typology is because they're typically developed, right, as one entity that share in that cottage, in that shared open space, right? And so there is some that I think could maybe meet that definition. The second thing I think that you brought up that's important to note, right, are some of the statistics, and most of the things here were pulled from ACS and census data that talk to building types and units, right, in what format they're delivered. So there's certainly some issues, there could be some misses on those numbers for sure. We haven't dug deeper into each specific option, and we can certainly look at that. But one of the reasons, right, so that clearly defines multifamily is anything 3 and up, right? And so zoning and the ACS and the census data has very clear definitions for single family on its own fee simple lot, single family attached, right, where it shares a wall but still fee simple, and then it usually calculates duplex, right, and above that as multifamily, right? And so that's where there's a lot of different, and I know it gets tricky in the presentation because the numbers sort of shift slightly depending on which definition you're looking at, right? So on one hand, some of the numbers are looking at where you have just zoning and land use that only permits single family, and that's one calculation regardless of what's actually built on the property. It's on what the zoning calls for. And on the other hand, the statistics have what's actually built, and that's coming from some of the census. Does that clarify?
No.
Oh.
I would specifically like to know, if you consider those 3 subdivisions to be middle housing, and then what your reaction would be to a proposal to build another Wimbledon Court type subdivision. I'm assuming you haven't been shown it yet. I'm just throwing this out.
And I don't want to speak specifically because I might be mixing up neighborhoods, but I'm sure we saw Wimbledon. And I think the one thing I didn't address that you brought up, right, was in our definition, it's twofold, right? The first and foremost is this form and scale and multiple units. The second piece is that it tends to address, right, middle income households, right? And that's the second piece of it, but it's not a guarantee, right? And it's not always consistent, right? So we know there can be multifamily housing, right, that is at luxury price points, right? Because of the form and the scale, if it's a 6 unit or an 8 unit building, we would still consider that missing middle. That's really why we start to use those 3 criteria for addressing, is it feasible, is it attainable, is it livable, right? So those are 2 different things. So no, I wouldn't define housing types in your community that are predominantly single family but meet that middle income level as missing middle. And that is something that comes up a lot in our work. We get sent all the time, right, projects that are 150 units and they're calling them missing middle, right, because they are achieving middle market rate housing. And so I think, that's why we say first and foremost, the form matters first, and then the hope is that they are hitting that middle income target, but that's market dependent. Does that help any, hopefully? But I think it's something we can continue to look at.
We'll go on the field and confirm, George.
I'm asking specifically about specific areas of the village, and I just would like to know what you think, or the consultant thinks if you classify those as our target or not.
I generally do not, but I think what I think doesn't matter as much of, is that a type that you want to see and that you need more of in your community? And if the answer is yes, that's something that we want to see more of, then we should very much look at those examples and say, is this matching the underlying zoning? Is this what we want? That's exactly what we want, is to look at places in your community and say, we need more of this, right? What are the standards? What are the sizes? What are the scale, right? And make sure that that's aligning with our regulations. So I think you're on the right track of identifying places you want to see more of, no matter what the definition.
I'm not necessarily advocating more of the sanctuary, but
yes, right? I wouldn't call it missing middle, right? Or promoting walkability, but we want to identify types that resonate in Lake Bluff, right? That's the goal, is to really test those things, right? And get down to that level of saying, okay, what size lot is that? What size house? Is it achieving price points that you want, right? Then there's some success there. What could we do better, right? Could we improve, which I think I know which ones you're talking about. Could we improve the walkability? Could we improve the sense of community, right? What could we do in our regulations to improve those? there's lots of examples we can look to that hit, one or two of those characteristics of missing middle, but maybe fall short on the other ones, right?
And then just one other quick note for you, as a note, before you go crunching on the Zenny property, the Crabtree Farm property that you showed, please find out what areas are already under conservancy,
Yes.
because there's no sense dividing
I
that
appreciate
property up,
And I just,
not recognizing that there is conservancy already on
no, there absolutely is. and
large
that's-
pieces of that.
Yeah, we have the survey for that.
Okay.
And I should note, right, these are all theoretical tests where we're gonna quickly look at, schematic ideas of what capacity could a site like that even handle, right? What does a cottage court look like on that site? How can these missing middle types respect, right, some of those environmental and natural concerns that are such a big part of Lake Bluff, right? So how can you have both a best world, like the best of both worlds is what I tried, right? But we are aware of the conservation and the tree easements on that site. We do have some questions, right? And we're certainly not doing a refined architectural plan, but we want to start to sketch so you have a sense of what it could look like. What is the capacity? Is that something a developer would even be interested in, right? We're not making any, hard and fast development proposals, but we hope it would inspire or inform a conversation about the potential of that site, right? Because you have a couple of those, a handful of sites that are not right in your R4 or R5 zoning district, but not necessarily, right? But that could potentially provide some more housing diversity if you wanted it.
George, can I just ask what's, no, I'm blind,
The 6-unit just north of Armor Woods, Oak Ridge Court.
Oak Ridge.
Yeah.
Is that the one with the 2 units that are attached? Yeah, that's I think from a missing
I
middle
mean,
standpoint, that's the
all of
one.
the 3 subdivisions I'm referencing are
All
all
have that attached.
duplex units,
Yeah,
and
Yeah.
with the exception of the Wimbledon Court subdivision, that I
that's one I'm not so
would
sure.
like to hear what you think of that in terms of it meeting your definition of middle.
I'm gonna go look it up, 'cause that one I'm not so sure of. The other two I can picture, right, the attached duplexes, and those I think by building type standpoint would meet missing middle in many instances. I think the format of them, right, prioritizing the drive and the garage on the front, and the way that those streets are situated, right, don't necessarily meet the criteria for supporting walkability or community and things like that. Although that doesn't mean that it's doesn't have those aspects
Mhm.
internally. But. Any other?
I have a question about when you were talking about the financing.
Yeah.
And when that becomes a barrier, is that something that can be addressed? Can we go out to a local bank and have them do something, or is that like federal direction or both?
Yes, both.
Okay.
I think we've seen a lot of success and conversations when we go into communities and we talk to stakeholders, right? We want to include those financial institutions, those local credit unions and banks, right? Because a large part of it is just that they're not familiar with these products. Federal guidelines often, actually align 3 and under units can use, right? Buildings that have 3 and under can use the same financing as a single family house, pretty straightforward.
So we don't have to go out and change that.
Not necessarily, but often we encounter, right, because they're not done very commonly, a little bit of pushbacks from financial institutions. And that piece, can be fixed with conversations about what this is, what the performa looks like, right? Because often we don't have similar comps or products. So there's some things like that. There's other things from a federal standpoint, right, that it's a whole lot harder. There have been states, I don't think Illinois is going to be one of them anytime soon, right, that have amended their building code, right, which is another key barrier. There's been states that have refined that to include 4 units and under that fall now into the International Residential Code, which is, a little bit more straightforward and doesn't require the fire and sprinkler and elevator, things like that, or construction. That gets a little bit more complicated, but that's a bigger lift, right? And we certainly advocate for talking policy, but there's probably more important work to be done locally first
I have a little bit of a bias coming into this because I have been doing missing middle housing for 30 years in my career. And, but one thing I would say as a citizen of Lake Bluff, if planning and zoning wants to think about this and a broader idea of this is also take into account some other kind of additional costs or issues that come up when you create higher density, which would be infrastructure and stormwater, particularly for us, as issues of cost that come along. The impact on retail, which may only be positive, and also other side effects that can have cost considerations, like schools, or other provisions for, say, the elderly. I mean, all of these things need to be kind of thought all the way through to think about what does higher density mean for us in every aspect of our community and what we provide for the community and how we govern. So
Yeah.
that would be my one suggestion as we step through this very interesting process.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's an important aspect to note. You know, I do think there are so many things at play, right? That we can't think of fixing zoning as a silver bullet, right? There are other issues in terms of infrastructure. I'm glad you brought that up, right? I think that's an important reason why we talk a lot about, and we don't come in to most rooms and say, you need more density, right? It's never a good way to enter a room. Because we want to talk about, there are those real implications, right, of adding more housing. And it's why we're so focused on that smaller end, right, of 2 units, 4 units, 6 units, right, on a lot. And most of the time, and this is a conversation you should be having with your engineers, right, with your stormwater management, of what can the system handle, right? Most of the time, we're not hitting those tipping points, not always, but not hitting those tipping points that you would see with a 20 unit or a 40 or 50 unit building that really does require substantial upgrades in the infrastructure or does put, you know, a burden on the other systems, potentially, right? But when we're talking about missing middle and we're talking about these demographics, right, of single person households and things like that, generally we find mostly benefits to the systems when we actually get down to, you know, how many students are adding to the school, how many trash cans, right, it's adding to the capacity. Those are important things to think about, and they are concerns from your community, so you need to have an answer and address them. And the best way we've seen to do that is really look at projects like we showed here, right, that are doing it. They're figuring it out. They're figuring out where to have the services, right? We can sort of start to test what that looks like. And so that's why we want to start to show and have these conversations, and I'd love to see some of the work, you know, you've been doing and get some of that knowledge locally of what are, because every community is different, right, of where the pinch points are, right? Is it stormwater, right? What are the costs? Is it the water and sewer taps? Is it the infrastructure, right? What are the breaking points, right? Because what we usually see, and some of the reasons why we do the test fits is to give you that information of potential capacity that a site could handle so that you can test some of these things and have those real world conversations in your community with local builders, right, with local suppliers, with local engineers to say what would this look like, right? Where would you worry about this project? Having those conversations up front could be really helpful to say, all right, let's look deeper at that regulation or what incentives, right, or what can we do as a village to address some of those pinch points. That's really the heart of why we do so much of this visualization and test fits, right? We are not developers. We have no interest in being that, right? But we want to give you those tools, right? Because once a development is on the table and they've gone through the architectural drawing, they've gone through all the work, it's a lot of cost to start changing those proposals, right? We all know that. And so this hopefully gives you the opportunity to have some of those conversations up front and preemptively address some of those concerns.
And you know, George brought this up, one other thing is context. And we have a few different contexts within this community, and
Yeah.
each one is totally unique. I mean, if you look at Harrison House, or I can't remember what we call it, but the Harrison House property, that's something that has a completely different context than East Lake Bluff.
Yeah.
And how you address issues like what we're talking about tonight, so.
Yeah, and that's really why I think it's so smart and perfect for you guys to be thinking about this under the umbrella of the comp plan, right? Because that's really where you want to start to give guidance of what are the areas in your village that make sense. There's going to be many that don't, right? From an infrastructure, from a water, from a sewer standpoint, right? That don't make sense. So you want to start to identify in the land use plan and the guidance in your housing policy and comp plan can start to set that up for success, right? And start to have the conversation about where you think it's reasonable and where it may not make sense to prioritize. You had a conversation.
I
Question?
just echo Charlie's comments, and thank you for coming, it was a very good presentation. Over the past 20 years, as I've engaged in these conversations in our community, frequently somebody interprets the conversation as meaning affordable housing.
Yeah.
And as I think about the dozen or so people that are perhaps just a little bit older than I am that have moved out of this community because they couldn't find a housing solution here, as I think about my own situation, it isn't so much affordability that is driving that. It isn't affordability at all, in fact. It's manageability. It's a single floor, it's smaller footprint, so it's manageability. You used an interesting term. Instead of affordability, you said attainability. So I wonder, is attainability a universal level or is it specific to the community? Obviously, attainability in our community is a different number than it is for Lake County. So
Yeah.
when you say attainability, is it relative to Lake Bluff or how are you using it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And it falls into this category of things that we have a definition for and things that we're trying to sort of define more clearly, right? So that we can have these conversations more effectively, right? So federally, university, right, we define affordability typically as 60% AMI and below. So that number changes depending on location. So we try to use the term attainability, right? Because missing middle is not typically addressing that 60% and below. That's just not what's happening when you build these, right? You can't, unless it's subsidized, right, which is not necessarily what we're talking about here. We're not addressing that capital A affordable that meets the needs of the lowest income, right? So we use the term attainability because it starts to hit that 80% to 120, right around that 100%, AMI, and that means different things for different communities. So that's why we started to look at what is the area median income in Lake Bluff, and what does attainability mean for that group, right? So that's where we want to start to put these things together. Is your housing meeting the needs of people in your community, right? And when we look at that, it's fairly well aligned. It's a little bit off because housing of any kind is expensive right now, but that's what we want to get at. Attainability means different things for different communities, and so, but generally we're talking about 80% to 120% that's attainable. I think you made a really great point of really what it's, and why we talk more about housing choice than we do affordability or attainability, right? Because it's that choice that isn't present in most of our markets, regardless of cost, right? There aren't those smaller units that offer some of the characteristics of a house, right? The porch, a little bit of yard space, right? People don't want, even millennials, right, and younger families, don't necessarily want the big maintenance of a big lot or a big house, right? These things and these preferences are all shifting, right? But the housing that we've built over the last 50 years, right, doesn't align with those preferences very well. And that's not to say that preference for that house doesn't exist. It's just that we have that predominantly in our market to fill that need, and we don't have those choices for people that want to downsize or want a more manageable type, right? And so that is really at the crux of it, and why we sort of prioritize this conversation about housing choice. Nick, did you have another question as well?
Yeah, I don't take this wrong, anything I say.
No.
There's a lot of being in the weeds right now.
Yes, yeah, that's fair.
And it seems like, number one, question to answer is the village willing to pursue this? And I assume they are, because we wouldn't be here, they would have hired you guys. So we kind of put that down as a yes. The second one is, is there a way to quantify it in terms of, is it 10% of the housing stock, is it 15%, is it 12%, what is it?
Yeah.
It's gonna be required. I mean, I'm one of these people, I had a 3,500 square foot house, built in 1878, and I wanna tell you, I spend most of my time, the last 20 years, trying to keep it standing.
Fair enough, yeah.
It's a good shot. So anyway, the other thing to look at is, and I'm sure you started to look at, is available property to do what you're talking about. And one of you missed, which is the south side of North Avenue, which is zoned R5, and it right now is a small little rentals. And there was a point in time when we had talked about, well, somebody else had talked about, well, that's going to be a great big long block long building.
Right.
That obviously is not the solution. But there's other property in the village that is owned by the village. And whether it's suitable or not, I don't know. The 176 corridor has got some very interesting topography and spaces that you could maybe do something that doesn't have to mean, it doesn't have to look like an 1890s house. It doesn't have to be a cottage with a 4-foot front porch.
Right.
You know, it could be contemporary, it could be staggered, it could be all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But it seems like each one of these pieces of property is going to develop its own context,
Yeah.
which is going to have its own demand on what these things look like and how big they are and so on and so forth. And none of them are going to be walkable.
Sure.
There is nothing around that is within walking distance unless you're really healthy. You know, downtown.
Yeah.
So
No, I think-
those are kind of broad things, but not broad things. So
Yeah, and it's a
start out by
hard
saying
line.
we're in the weeds, but
And
let's
it was
not
a
talk
hard
about
line to
forests.
walk, right? Like, we want to have this conversation very broadly, but admittedly, we get deep in the weeds because the stuff is certainly interested to me, but we also know that sort of one thing, right, one silly regulation that's been on the books forever can make or break these projects, right? And these types of developers aren't coming to the table if they're not allowed by right.
Yeah, well, I can tell you
But-
that being the village's building code gets stricter and stricter and stricter every time we revise it.
Yeah, that's a
And
whole
we're talking
other,
about probably
yeah,
$600 or $700 a square foot to build a house.
yeah,
You know.
yeah.
And that's probably on the, you know that better than me. No?
No, probably not.
Oh, okay.
It's hard to, yeah.
Anyway, the point is that there's a lot of floating parts that need to be thought about outside the box.
Yeah,
Well, okay, this is what zoning says, but maybe we've got to break that for this. Right now, everything has to be sprinkled because it's residential. But that's
Yes,
not a
I
big
know.
deal.
Well,
That's not a big deal.
Yeah.
The sustainability stuff is becoming a big deal.
sure.
But very expensive.
Yeah, right?
And
The
so,
insulation and the fire.
And I don't think you want to throw that away.
No, I mean, all those things are well intended, right? There's a good reason we have the building code, right, for life safety.
Yeah.
Right? And we don't ever want to downplay that. But there's a cost and a benefit
Right.
to everything. But I think you brought up a lot of really great points. First and foremost being, right, is that this clearly is something that's been talked about in your community, but is it what you want, right? Is it something the community can get behind? It's sort of a very important first question. I think that's why we hope that this presentation can help start to have some of those conversations, right? About which types make sense, which types don't, where. The other thing I think you brought up is sort of this conversation about, available property and parcels and things like that. And the reality is most of your community, especially your urban neighborhoods, that you're close to downtown, walkable neighborhoods are built out, right? And so there's one aspect of protecting that character and that scale, right? And that's an important piece to understand in your zoning, and we want to make sure that the zoning aligns and start to protect that small lot character that makes your downtown core so walkable, right, and so safe, and all of those aspects, right? So that is one piece we're gonna see.
That part's pretty easy. The part I'm talking about now becomes hard.
Yeah, no, it only gets harder, right? But I want to make sure to note that, right? Because I do think you can fix your zoning. The reality is there are not many parcels that are even at play when we're talking about CBD and R5, right? So that's a big reason why we're focused on these opportunity sites, not because they're the only properties that can or should, but it starts to give you some ability to have the conversations about what works and what doesn't, and how can we replicate those lessons learned to other properties. I think the other piece that you brought up that was really smart was this idea of, we certainly advocate and think that Missing Middle is most successful when it's embedded in walkable, environments, right? Because you have access to transit, right? So the parking, you can have a little bit more flexibility there. The walkability, the access to amenities, things like all of that, right? That allow people to make trade-offs and want that smaller unit and have some more mobility choices. Those are important. But we also, in our work, and when we encourage you in communities at the comp plan level to look at it, is also to identify not only those walkable areas or opportunities that align already with the characteristics, but also to look at some of those areas that might transform over time, right? And so how can you take some of these characteristics of creating community, creating accessibility, and things like that, and build them into those environments, right? To offer some of these benefits of missing middle housing, even within different contexts.
So
And
the
so
other
that's-
thing that I think is fairly new, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is within probably 10 miles of here, there's at least 10,000 rental units being built. And that's all that's being built.
Yeah,
is
sure.
rental units.
Yeah.
And then some of them have amenities, some of them are just boxes on the land.
Yep.
So that seems to be the trend with the younger generation. They want to own anything, they don't want to be tied down.
Yeah.
And so how does this fit in to that? Because we've got some people like that in this town. I mean, I don't need people like that, we've got young people in here that
Yeah.
can't afford to, but if they could, I don't think they would.
Right. Well, I think that's one of the questions that you guys get to answer, right? But what we see in the trends and why we show missing middle, we don't describe missing middle as either rental or home ownership solely, right? There's different avenues and different types that align better with ownership and align better with rental, certainly. But there is a demand, and a growing demand, and a growing desire for renting, right? And so that's why you see these larger developments that are all rental, where they can have available land, right? And so that's certainly something I think we said when we show the diagram, when we talk about sort of these 3-4-story larger apartment complex, those are filling the need, and they're trying to meet these housing needs all in one fell swoop, right? Okay, because there's this demand for hundreds of units to meet the need and the preference of younger people, but also people that just don't want to, own a home anymore at any age bracket. And so those are coming out of, right, this development system that we've enabled, but also the need, and trying to do it in one fell swoop. Where missing middle is starting to provide that, in smaller products that align better in different contexts. Because, right, I think, like some of the examples you showed of the bigger multifamily apartment, those wouldn't be appropriate in most of Lake Bluff, right? So they're being built on the outskirts of town that generally require people to drive further and further. They, certainly put weight on infrastructure that doesn't always have it that far out from downtown, of course, and things like that. And so I think it's a really, those are one part of the solution to fill the housing need, but we have to have other options besides just those big buildings that are built on the outskirts.
We don't have room for that.
What's that?
We don't have room for that.
Right.
Nor desire for that.
Right.
One thing I would, if you haven't done it, George mentioned Armor Woods. Armor Woods was built maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago.
80s. Yeah.
Anyway, have you been out there?
Yes, have been there. Yeah.
And that started out as actually 55 and older.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I did.
But it's not anymore. And there's families in there. But those are master on the first floor. 2 bedrooms upstairs, most of them, 2-car garage, and they started out fairly reasonably. Now you can hit one for 800,000 if you're lucky. So.
That's what we see in a lot of, right?
That's what happens.
Yeah, no, it is an important thing to think about, right? That's typically what we have in, I think, those townhouses. And the Muse product that we saw in Lake Bluff, that was sold for $220,000, right? Significantly less than what was the status quo in that market, and now they're much more, right? And you know, so there are some tools that communities are using to try to attain or maintain that attainability over time, if that's desired, if that's needed, but they're sort of separate, right? I think first and foremost, we just don't have those housing choices, and once they're proven in a market, they become very popular because they're so needed. And so I think that's what you generally see with those examples. Whether they're the best design or not, they're so needed that they end up going up in price and filling very quickly. Oh yeah, you make all good points. Anyone else?
Well, you mentioned something about recruiting developers.
Yeah.
Right? And then and to recruit a developer, having the developer interested, it has to be feasibly, financially, a benefit.
Yeah.
But they also have come before us before and had some beautiful plans and had opposition in a community.
Yeah.
And I know you're mentioning the Foreman scale that fits, and you mentioned that several times, and I think that's a good talking point for this community, in that, we're not doing something that is not supposedly in this character. But I find it very enlightening about this missing middle that perhaps could change the architecture or look within the footprint and be something different, but it all has to be with this developer that is willing to, come forward with a plan that can work. And when you say recruit, is this something that you're showing your lovely presentation and trying to encourage a developer to think about missing middle, or are you planning on doing it? Because there was a couple good developers even in our community that might benefit from hearing your story.
We certainly hope so, right? That's why we do a lot of this work, why we define types, so that you can have those conversations and we can sit down with local developers and builders, or you can sit down with them to say, hey, look at this type, right? Does the duplex make sense? Is that something you would do? Is the fourplex too scary, right? Too much of a complicated product because of the IBC? Are you willing? Right? The answer is different for different builders and developers, but we can't have those conversations until we have sort of a sense of what we're talking about, right? And so I think there's the one side of it is, having these conversations with local builders and trades and developers to say, what products are you willing? Are you willing to go from your single family house to a duplex, right? Are you willing to go to a 6 or a 10plex, right? Is that something that you would look at? And I think hopefully this conversation starts to open up, or this material and the study helps to open up some of those conversations. I think the flip side, right, and the pushback that many developers and builders shy away is because of the community pushback, right? They know that if they bring that to the table, right, the public review and the public meeting is going to be a headache, right? And it's going to require them to do changes that may or may not get approved anyway, right? Just because it's a multifamily product, right? Or it's 3 stories or whatever it is, right? There's different criteria that are important. And so I think, the hope is with this type of presentation is that you can start to get the community's input and have those conversations, right, from both sides, right? What's feasible for a developer to build? I think it's also important to make the community aware of that, right? There's a reason why developers push for that 3 or 4 story building, right? There's a financial motivation there, right? Because they can't make those numbers work. And there's a reason why 4 units might not pencil, but 6 units might in your community, right? They're doing the back of the napkin pro forma on all these types. And so the hope is, and what we've seen done in other communities, I just had a developer send me, we have a missing middle product line out, and we just had a developer send me a pro forma off the cuff and say, I can't make that work. I said, well, try the 6plex, right? what does that look like? Does it get us closer? Right? This is why we say, so it's not a one-size-fits-all. Not every type makes sense in every community. But it allows you, by talking about these types, by looking at what are we really talking about in size and scale, you can have those conversations, and they can give you informed answers of what makes sense, what makes sense. And you can have that conversation with your community and say, oh, they're comfortable with the cottage court. They might be comfortable with the duplex, right? And so it's that back and forth of sort of this, feasibility, is attainability and livability. And there's a lot of different stakeholders that matter.
Thank you. I listened to your entire presentation at home before I came, starting at 7 o'clock. I think you missed the point. I think that Lake Bluff, because of the history of being a church camp,
Sure.
has many starter homes.
Yeah.
My starter home was 311 North Sheridan Place. It's been since embellished, but there's many houses in what I'll call the West Terrace that are not any less affordable today than they were when I bought in 1969.
Yeah.
My best friend started home was in at 317 Vincent. So there are many small houses that in today's environment are affordable. And I don't think you touched on that at all.
That's
I
fair.
think that there's plenty of multifamily places near here. They're just not in the village, city, or village
village
limits.
boundaries. Yeah.
And so I didn't see you touch on any of that at all. You do a wonderful job of filling the time. It's difficult to get more words in. But I think that your premise of the middle being missing here is just plain wrong. I think that there's plenty of starter homes here. I think there are plenty of middle houses between starter and
Bigger
I'll say
multifamily.
older houses, yeah.
Sure.
But I think that there's no real building room here. The building room here exists when people tear down existing homes to put in other homes, and that's what's going to continue here. You brought up the place where Lake Bluff Bank used to be in the lot next to it as a place that has potential. I may not be using the right terms. But we haggled with that particular property in this community a number of years ago, not that many years ago,
Yeah.
and found a solution that most people agreed with. Not the developer didn't agree with it. And so this particular community is not the kind of building situation that you're presenting. You presented places in, if I remember right, Kansas City, California, Iowa, that don't apply here. We don't have open fields to put that stuff in. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you being here, but I don't agree with any of really what you said.
Fair enough, and I think it's an important, I'm really thankful for your voice here, right? And that feedback, right? Because I don't think you're an uncommon perspective in Lake Bluff, right? And it's one we need to talk about, right? And have that conversation between those that support this and those that don't, right? And have different opinions on what's right in Lake Bluff. So I appreciate all that commentary. I don't think you're wrong. I do think that you make a really good point, right, about the starter homes. You do have a lot of smaller homes and smaller lots in your community that play an important role, that have historically as a starter home, and those things have changed, and they're certainly not affordable or attainable to as many people now. And I do think it's an important conversation to have about where you want to see multifamily, right? Because I think you both brought up the point that it is being built in close proximity to Village Bluff. There are those options being built elsewhere. And so that's not something I'm trying to discredit. I think there is really the conversation that the character and the scale of Lake Bluff makes it difficult. That's why I think it's not appropriate to talk about a third or two-thirds of the building types that we often show on our missing middle diagram, right? I don't even think those, I think I'd be crazy to come in and say that and push for those here, right? I don't think they make sense. The reason we're here, the reason I'm even bringing up Block 1 and Block 3, right, or the larger properties, is because they have had proposals, right, with some good things and some bad things. There has been pushback, right, and so I think it's important to have that conversation about why those proposals didn't work, why they were supported by some, and start to dig into that. And it's really about whether the community wants, what steps you want to take to fulfill the goals in your strategic plan.
Jennifer, if I may, we've got a couple questions or comments from the public, I guess.
Oh, great.
Remotely.
Yeah, we have, Brad Anderson has been writing a few comments and questions kind of along with the presentation. So the first one, he says, I applaud the PCZBA for providing the excellent presentation. The presenter provided a great deal of insight into one of our most overlooked zoning districts. While many attempts have been made to correct or examine our R5 district, to date, no changes have been implemented. I'm so excited to see our inability to adapt for change is being challenged. Thank you. He also said this was an incredible presentation. We clearly have an inventory of housing that does not provide needed housing for our aging population, nor allows a scale for the development of any type of multifamily to serve a different population. And a question he asked with that is, as you looked at Lake Bluff, which zoning district is most overlooked? There are a few more if you want to kind of address them at the end. The very fact that our population has dropped over the last couple decades suggests we have missed the market. We must grow to help our village flourish into the future. I believe every multifamily dwelling unit that is located within 3 blocks of the CBD is occupied. I feel it speaks volumes to demand and necessity to increase the use of our R5 district, and ask for your thoughts on that. And then just one last comment. Brad Anderson said, I totally disagree with the comments about no need in Lake Bluff. Many of us who are vested in Lake Bluff would prefer to stay in Lake Bluff. There is a reason we live here and do not want to leave.
No, thanks for all those questions and
Wait a
comments.
second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before you answer that,
Yeah.
I was curious, what is the zoning, I know it's multifamily, for R5? What is, R5? Is it the typical 29 feet or 28 feet height restriction there with the multifamily homes? What can or what can't we put on? Like say tear down a single row of rentals and put up a 2-story rental or a 2-story townhouse. Do we know what the zoning is at this point? What the restrictions are?
So one difficulty that Jennifer brought up is that in our use table, single family is allowed by right, but multifamily, the one that is listed is condos. Those would require a special use. So other than single family, even in R5, no more than one unit is allowed.
Well, I see that as definitely a zoning issue that needs to be addressed. If we're thinking about adding the middle to like an R5 district that's walkable to downtown, I mean, that's something that can be certainly addressed. And I certainly think that a developer may come in and say, well, these 4 single-family rentals, I can do better than that. And then I don't think we have as much complaints from the community because it's in where it's at. So
Yeah,
I think we got to start with the zoning. We can talk all we want about what we want. It's pie in the sky. But if it's not zoned properly, we're not going to get anything accomplished.
Yeah, I think that's really the point, and that would be how I answer Brad's question of which zones make sense, because you have to start by better understanding, right? The people in this room probably have a better sense than most of the community, but even then, and this is not uncommon in most places we go, right? We have to understand what our current zoning is actually encouraging and allowing, and that's not always clear, right? We can look at these numbers on the books, but they don't make a lot of sense, right? What's the difference between 30 feet height limit and 34? What does that look like? Right? That's what people care about. And so that's, if you remember the diagram with sort of the 3 small buildings, right? That's what we want to do, right? And that's what we're going to do in your R5 and your CBD is look at what does the zoning say it allows, your buildable envelope, right? What are the height? What does that look like, right? What is the setup? What do each of your zones produce? And then look at what does it actually encourage under existing regulations once you layer in parking and landscape, right? Those things. What does that actually look like? What are you able to build? What's the best case scenario? What's the most capacity? Right? We can't make these decisions until we understand what are the outcomes that you're getting or could get currently, right? It's important to test those before development's on the table. So that's part of this process, right? Is identifying what your existing zoning is producing and answering the question, is that what you want, right? And where are the gaps? You know, so to Brad's question, right? I don't have the answer of how far you should or shouldn't push, right? How far R5 or any multifamily zone should be mapped requires much more community input, right? But we want you to understand what tools you have, right? Because it's one thing for your comprehensive plan to say, we support more diversity housing, and then look at your zoning and say, there's nowhere that that can be built. Right? And so you need to align the 2 things, right? That's the goal of the comp plan, is to give guidance to your regulations, your zoning that enforces those goals, right? And so we want to make sure that those things are aligned. And you can't make those decisions until you understand what tools you have in your books now and what outcomes you could get, theoretically, right? If someone were to tear down the house and things like that, you know, what could be built? Worst case scenario type of thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, and one interesting thing I just saw recently was, you know, I know that there's a lot of, as we go further west toward Mundelein and, you know, places like that, there are, McHenry is doing big planned unit community, you know, big planned unit community, single family purchase. But I just found one in Antioch that is rentals. So it's 13, but it's not high rises, it's not even mid rises, it's cottages essentially in size. And they're on quite small amounts of land. It is maintenance free, but it's not age restricted. It's not 55 plus or anything. But they're 1,300 to 1,700 and they will square feet, and they will purely, so it's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath unit, single story. Most of them don't even have basements, but they will remain owned by the developer at this point, or they'll sell similar to what a Focus does or something. But they will only be rental units. Yeah. And apparently it's really capturing, you know, to your point, young and old audiences are definitely being drawn to that. But it was interesting to see it as single-family looking homes, small in a neighborhood. So
yeah, I think those are the case studies you should be looking at and thinking about, right? Is this something we want, and how did they do it? You know, certainly like the example from Omaha is not one that could be replicated, you know, on 50 acres and 700 units of land, but that's the takeaway.
Right.
As the developer was identifying a need that needed to be filled, right? He didn't have comps, he didn't have precedent in that region, and he was looking a lot further out, saying, I think, you know, the market's telling me we have a need for this, I want to try something different. And it proved the market and changed mindsets. And that's why we talk a lot about pilot projects and studying case studies, things like that, that can help move the conversation along and be more fruitful than just saying we need more multifamily, right? Because that generally doesn't get us very far, and for good reason, right? So I think those are really great examples to look at. I'm not familiar with that one, but I think that's, you know, the more local examples and things like that you can have and sort of have this conversation, or what are the characteristics you want to reinforce or think about? Oh, there.
Just a question. I mentioned earlier that there's property around here that's owned by the village. Whether it's right or not, I don't know. But let's assume for a minute that it is right. How does that work when you try to entice a developer to come along? To me, it's not sell the property to the developer and let him do his thing. If the village drives the train the whole way.
Right.
Is that right?
There's no right or, that's a question for Drew. I'm gonna throw that one out there. No, I think
He
here's,
wants to do that.
that's what but you need to you need to sort of test it and understand. Does that make sense for a developer to hold the property, right? What do the numbers look like? Right, I don't have those answers off
I think Charlie's the best person to answer this, but the idea that the village, if the village finds alignment from a land use plan and zoning regulations, that signals to the development community that it's a low-risk venture, which is important risk management for developers to try to come in and get something done and not take 3 years to go through the entitlement process and spend a lot of money doing that. But the village has, just with Block 1, we were the primary property owner. We issued an RFP. People came in, the village, turned over the keys
That's
to
kind of
them.
what I'm asking.
Yeah, so that's what the village, for example, like the same site on Block 1, the northwest corner, the village owns that little slice of that. That's the piece that the village did participate with the missing middle housing competition. But if the village really wanted to do that, the village could talk to neighboring property owners, bundle that site together, issue an RFP. And if there's alignment from the comprehensive land use plan and the zoning regulations to allow that to happen, then things like that, developments happen.
So, similar to Block 1?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think thank you, Drew. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but I appreciate that answer. I think developers are pretty savvy at this step, right? They see the opportunity, right? They can pretty quickly look at what is welcome in a community and what the regulations allow easily, right? And that is a key incentive to aligning, like Drew said, aligning your regulations with where you want to see. So whether or not, whatever role the village ends up playing, right, that's a clear signal. Say we support this type of development here, and that has real weight, right? Both in monetary and time and effort that a developer is willing to go through. And so that's something, we encourage you to just be clear about, right? There's not a right or a wrong of where you set those benchmarks necessarily, right? But there's benefit to both sides in being more clear about what you want and what the community is willing at different places in the village.
I do have one comment question. You're going to do these 3 case studies that you talked about, and I'm assuming that staff helped you pick these 3 examples. And as I sit here and think about it, I don't know why we would spend the community's tax dollars coming up with a cartoon drawing for middle housing on Mr. Zenni's property on Crabtree Farms. It was only, the village has a 10-acre piece that we own, right on the other side of Green Bay Road. Wouldn't it be more practical, if we're going to spend, there's only so much money, wouldn't it be better, wouldn't we get closer to the truth, to analyze a piece, like, let me finish.
Oh, I'm glad. This is exactly what you should be doing. Go, please.
7 years or 8 years ago, I think Elliot and Gary were on the board. The property just to the north of Zenny in Crabtree, I mean, it's a beautiful area. And I think most of the residents love that area. And someone requested that a 25-acre lot be split in half, and it got denied. And now we're talking about coming up with a cartoon drawing for 20 homes in Crabtree on a lot right on the lake, in a piece of property where they're asking $30 million. I don't see we'll have a wonderful drawing, but it doesn't seem practical to me. But that 10-acre piece that the village owns, right on the other side of Green Bay Road and just to the south of 176. I don't know why we wouldn't spend the precious dollars that we have noodling that a little bit, just to see, hey, then we've got something that's, I think, some people are going to be willing to talk about, but the Crabtree piece, to me, it's gonna blow up right away. There's no, in my view, it's just a proverbial snowball chance that would ever go
I bring
anywhere.
in negativity only because it's such a beautiful piece of property. Why even have a conversation?
Anyway, I throw that out because we're spending money, we're spending time. We don't get to do this very often. It just seems that would be a piece that would be better to put our arms around instead. Throwing it out.
No, we talked about that a lot. We talked about Stonebridge. Should we use Stonebridge site as an example site? And we struggled, and part of the reason we said, well, let's talk about that, and one of the things we talked about putting the slide is, let's talk about what the comprehensive land use plan says, calls for that site, Zinni's property, today, right? It talks about it pretty much staying the same, right? And that was the idea is, let's have an academic conversation about what this looks like, knowing where this is a site that it won't happen on, so that people wouldn't get afraid of what could happen. You know, it's like, look, this is an idea, a concept plan. So we talked about it internally, what made the most sense, and we talked about Stonebridge. Is that too controversial to cite? Is that going to be a lightning rod? Should we stay away from that? And we said, yes, stay away from that. The 10 acres, that's a great idea. We talked about that too. And so if you all say that's what you'd like to see, fantastic. I love that the conversation happens. And thank you, George, because that's why we talked about, let's show the sites, let's talk about why. I think, is there any concern with the block 1 and block 3 sites? Does that make sense? That's where our 5 CBD, right? All that makes sense. We thought that was a slam dunk as well.
Is the
Tom?
10 acres the old North Shore right away?
It is not, well, it's south of there. It's between CLC Java and the West Terrace. It was formerly platted the West Terrace. I don't know what the actual subdivision title is, but it's...
So, it's west of the existing Sheridan Place in Prospect?
Correct.
That'd be fine. That's walking distance of Target.
Listen, I know the walking, I took exception to maybe some of Bob's comments about, I think everything's walkable. But, I mean, it's really, you're a stone throw from everything. It's all relative. Okay. But I think that's great. Thank you for doing that, George. But that, I mean, it was going to be an academic exercise, and we talked, and I think...
Yeah, that's why we wanted to show
I'd rather it be a practical exercise.
From an architect's standpoint, what a great site to design for, right? It's a fantastic property, right?
And then I'd also like, Stonebridge is everything's a hot button when you talk about the big.
But that'd be, should be worth
I would love to hear what Opticos thinks. Give Opticos the last plans that the village saw for the area that was going to be the senior
housing, sorry.
Created all those small, quote unquote, small
Houses.
units that were going to sell for $800,000 10 years ago. And see if that meets the definition of what.
I'm sorry, you're talking about what Roanoke development?
What they already,
Yes.
just as an analysis, their feedback on that, just that slice of the pie.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear what they think about
Sure.
that, because it could come back, who knows when, the same way.
Yeah, and I remember when the developer was presenting that product, it got bigger and bigger. It went from like 1,400 to, then it was 1,800, it was 2,000, and he was increasing the size of that product based off the feedback from his real estate professionals, telling him to make it bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, the original drawings, like you're talking about, George, I thought immediately about those plans relative to you talking, I don't remember your term, but the little cluster cottages.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's basically what that was.
That's what he was trying to create.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You lost the advance.
Yeah.
That's who owns the property that used to be the old North Shore right away, where the bike path is now? Is that available to be built on it by somebody at some point, or not?
Highly unlikely. I think that's, it's either IDOT or Lake Dot. And then there's all kinds of big utilities in there, water mains.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
The other reason, thank you, George, for bringing that up, the other reason about not wanting to do a Zenny property is we did have fairly high dense requests for some of those larger 25-acre properties up there. And I don't really want to have people thinking, oh yeah, let's, you know, I just don't think it's it wasn't viable then, and, you know, I think you're smarter to say, let's try to make it someplace where it makes sense to use your brain power and manpower and everything to really get some creative ideas kicked off.
That sounds great. I mean, I think that's the feedback we're sort of looking for and want you guys to be able to have. So we can set examples that do, you know, take a step forward in the conversation and get past. I think we love, and Drew and Clara have been kind enough to send us some previous proposals that we love looking at in PTA, and there's certainly some good ones in the past that if we had all the time in the world, we'd love to go back and say, what are those conversations?
What did you like about this, what did you not like
Right,
about
well,
this?
what happened to that, why didn't this happen, right? Because those are really important to understand, and we certainly don't want to set you up to have the same outcomes, right? And so I think that feedback is really appreciated.
I don't know how many of you are watching or examine the village's website for the comp plan. There's a map on there, people pinning comments on there. If you've viewed some of those, I read one today talking about the green belt along Sheridan Road. Someone said, why don't you put multifamily here? And you know, there's like some thumbs up and some thumbs down. But it's like, you know, where else makes sense? And that's come up before, but I know the village, I mean, that's another land use conversation you guys will be having about transportation and the green belt. Is that still desirable, right? I mean, this is the update. This is where you guys look at those areas and what makes sense, where are other opportunities? But it's, you know, that's what's exciting about this process.
And that's the goal with the comp plan.
Yeah.
Not, you know, it's not an easy job, right? Aligning all these aspects, but you want to make sure that whatever investment you're making, right, aligns, right? So where you're making investment on open space and trails, transit, or infrastructure, right? We should be aligning that with the goals of housing, right, and production and choice, aligning those things so that they can be, all of those efforts will be more successful. And so that's the exciting part of the comp plan, and why these conversations are so important. So I appreciate all of your time. I know it's getting late. I know I talked a lot, but I really appreciate this feedback, and we'll certainly take that into considerations as we take the next steps to analyze those zones, right, and try to show you what you're getting currently and what would have to change if you were to enable missing middle, and look at some of those opportunity sites so that you can make decisions moving forward with all of that in mind. So thank you so much for staying, and it's good to be here.
Tremendous presentation, Jennifer. Thank you for raising a lot of issues. There's a lot of different topics we have to address. I think the focus should be right now on properties that the village owns and controls. I think we have to be rather cautious when we look at private entities, other than perhaps Block 5 or Block 3, I should say, because that's been in play every so often.
Sure,
I
that
think
makes sense.
very, very positive exchange with the community and with us. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Agenda item number 5.
Yeah, I don't have anything other than what I gave for the updates on our comp plan as well.
Next month, maybe we'll have this.
No public hearings scheduled so far.
Amongst us.
Okay, I can.
I mean, I'm just throwing that out because we should take some of these ideas and just toss it around amongst ourselves and see what unofficial meeting if everybody could.
Yeah, I think that would be time well spent. Talk generally about the comp plan, or talk generally about
Or maybe you can put together the notes from today, what we can talk about. What she was talking about.
Yeah, I guess my only kind of thought on that is that we wouldn't have a plan at hand yet to kind of
we're gonna toss around ideas,
Okay.
what she just presented, and, you know, focus in on R5, focus in on what we can do with R4 with the empty lots. I guess some of we have the time to do it. And it's not enough for anything else. I know, but
Our limitations on it. So it's nice to be ahead of it, let's think about
maybe put it a little bit ahead, and they could show us and see if if I don't want to do it, that's fine, I'm just gonna get the time
Yeah.
set, why would I use it?
I'm just curious, granny flat idea. Has anybody come forward with it? The Excel, yeah, the extra dwelling unit on the lots that we went through the rules for everything. Has anybody requested it?
As of right now, no. No, the ADU, no one has requested as of yet.
Any more news on the hockey plans?
No.
Yeah, it was a great idea.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions or comments from the commissioners? Hearing none, agenda item number 7, motion to adjourn. Second? All in favor? Aye, motion carries. Thanks very much, good evening.